Just to confirm, we're doing the motion about the Philippines?
Yeah.
Alright, given the circumstances, we're going to cut all the preambles. 1A, whenever you're ready, let's go.
Progressives are not ultra-left. They want meaningful change, and meaningful change isn't necessarily entering into political landscape right now. It could look like building better foundational blocks like galvanizing more voters, expanding the influence of progressive values to begin with, and in the interim period, work in structures that actually help change towards the most vulnerable. If I'm able to illustrate why Leni Robredo is likely to fail, and the counterfactuals on our side are significantly better in terms of building a better roadmap for Philippines, especially for progressive values that actually help the vulnerable, we ought to take this debate. Two standards that I'm going to be very clear on what we're establishing in this debate. First, I'll explain why Leni Robredo is likely to fail in the pathway of getting the elections, and secondly, I'll explain why the host of our counterfactuals are significantly better at creating change. Before that, 3 points by way of framing. The first is I want to note what the context of the political climate in Philippines actually looks like. I think we need to note that there are 4 things that we can actually synthesize from this, and why exactly this is something that's important. Firstly, we need to note that the base is largely conservative, and they are pro the incumbent party due to the fact that they've established a political dynasty and oftentimes have a chokehold in the political climate, very little ability of opposition. Secondly, Leni has actively been sidelined during Duterte's administration. She hasn't been able to effectively advocate for so many policies that actually promote the progressive agenda. Third part to this point, the context of Philippines, is there's a great concentration of voters, particularly in areas that are urban. So this looks like voters consolidated in Metro Manila, but oftentimes outside of these urban areas, it's a significant challenge to galvanize voters that are not within those geographical areas. But finally, is that we can make an educated argument to suggest why she only preferred to be in politics only because there's no voters in the last election cycle. Because she made it very clear that the grounds in which she applied for late candidacy was because there's no one voting. It isn't a genuine good that she wants to be in politics. That's especially important to know. Second, what's the interest of progressive Filipinos actually look like? 4 things to take note of. Number 1, they're likely to want to disassociate from the poor track record of progressive in the past because they kept on losing even in the last elections. Number 2, they want to be in meaningful opposition to the incumbent conservative political party because there's a chokehold. And number 3, they want to actively help the most vulnerable because oftentimes the demographics they want to protect are oftentimes most persecuted by the state. This looks at the working class and ethnic minorities. And finally, and most crucially, their main goal is in 2 parts. Number 1, it's not to say that they want to actually win the next 2028 elections. It could be building foundational blocks. That means fighting for parliamentary senator seats, for example, in the next elections, or maybe expanding the voter base in the interim period to create a better consolidated democratic bloc in order to have a more successful roadmap to winning. Secondly, we need to note that Leni is already incompatible of this process of political landscape, given the fact that she already has a negative perception in the Filipino citizens because they perceive her to be extremely far left with absolutely no middle ground, because she has failed as the capacity of vice presidents when all of her policies like housing actually didn't materialize. That perception means we don't have to defend an actual counterfactual. We'll just explain why the foundational block is a net good. But just for the sake of engagement, we are okay with individuals like Neri Colmenares, who's a prominent human rights activist, and we are okay with these individuals who's probably more centrist in nature to be a candidate that we support, whilst at the same time, Leni can focus on an NGO. First argument then, why Leni would likely to face. The preface to this argument is I want to make it clear. Negative Team's roadmap to victory is contingent on the fact of Leni winning. And this is significantly important because Her failures are also considering all of the things that her failures that is likely to take place is considering the fact that she didn't have Angat Buhay during that time as well, and now she has to commit, so statistically and logically, they also have to prove how it's possible. Three parts to this argument. First, if we would argue that the climate is largely conservative in the Philippines. Four reasons to illustrate this. Number one, there's a great religious dogma which is often consolidated by Roman Catholicism. Number two, all social issues and the preferential that they have is often towards more traditional values. That's why they oppose things like same-sex marriage. That's why they oppose towards, they support traditional gender roles to be enforced. Third is that they have a chokehold of conservatism in the political landscape. Look at the major parties that have always won and consolidated power. This looks like the Nacionalista Party, or this looks like PDP Laban. These are all incredibly conservative parties that have a chokehold in the political landscape. And fourthly, is that often there's a great priority towards familiar landscape and nuclear family political public policy. This means those things are prioritized. Things like familial values are prioritized over other proximate issues that actually pertain towards the vulnerable because of this conservatism. The manifestation of this is simple. We think the current political landscape has a significant priority or preferential treatment towards conservative ideals, even at the expense when there's abuses of exploitation of the incumbent party. Look at what happened when there's extrajudicial killing. Look at what happened when the war on drugs took place. Look at what happened when the government actually embezzlement funds. They don't care. They value conservatism. They have to explain why, even in this dichotomy, this is something that is good. Second reason why she's likely to fail is because of Leni's commitment in and of itself. We can make an educated guess to say why in the last election she filed late candidacy because there's no candidates actually contesting. That just shows that she doesn't have a burning drive to actually want to be in the political landscape. It's probably the case because she's given up. It's probably the case because she has so much a negative perception, which means any form of policy she wants to do is difficult to coalesce. But it's important to note that she's not full-on heading in this particular area. Thirdly, is because of failed trajectory. We need to note that as a capacity of vice president during Duterte's presidency, she failed to enact housing policies that she was so passionate about. She failed to exert political influence because her political influence is only concentrated in a home region, like the Bicol region, for instance. So her ability to span the political influence across different divisions is something that's difficult to know. And finally, her perception. Everyone didn't trust her because she's seen as someone who is incredibly far left with no middle ground towards any form of compromise with the incumbent party. This is why she's likely to fail. Negative needs to prove otherwise. This was debate winning because we're nuancing to why she's likely to fail, not just on her will and her characteristics, but the perception that people have and a pathway of trajectory in this politics. Second argument, why is her counterfactual better? Two parts to this. Number one, why is another leader better? Four reasons why. Number one, there's a new face, which means it's not attached to all of the failures. Number two, it's more centrist, which is likely to be more relatable towards the middle ground of the politics. Number three, she's a career politician, not just an activist that wants to genuinely fight for active causes, but rather actually be in the political landscape. And finally, there's an incentive to actually repair all of the mistakes that Leni Robredo has done in the capacity to vice presidents. These are four reasons why people like Neri Colmenares would be a great face to the Democratic Party, because oftentimes this meets of the interest of the political party and the landscape to wanting to more accept Leni Robredo, rather than negative association that is backed on Leni Robredo's name. But secondly and more importantly, working on our NGO. In our capacity under Team Affirmative, we think Leni Robredo can fully commit towards the NGO of Angat Buhay. Why is this incredibly important? I just want to list out the monumental benefits that Angat Buhay has. Number one, that they deal with employment in so many agriculture sectors that actually skilled, vulnerable people. Number two, they have anti-poverty where social welfare systems are really working. Number three, more educational amenities where they have school supplies and infrastructure for the most vulnerable. Number four, they have disaster relief, contextualizing Filipino as a country that's prone towards natural disasters like flooding. They have oftentimes disaster reliefs that actually help the vulnerable. And fifth, they have health and nutrition, which is they help malnourished individuals and actually help towards amenities to seek for help. These are monumental benefits that directly help the most vulnerable. Two reasons why Leni Robredo don't have the capacity to do both. Number one, it's logistically impossible for her to be running as president at the same time commit the level of commitment and investments that she have towards this NGO. But secondarily, there'll be more attacks. If Leni Robredo focuses on NGO, people will say she's cronyism. People will say she's siphoning money when she's doing both. Because she's better off doing it alone, I think it's clear that we win this debate from first.
All right, thank you, first affirmative. I'll welcome my first negative speaker whenever they're ready to begin.
I think it's absurd how affirmative says that the political dynasty is too bad to the extent of where no change is possible, but also the fact that the point in which you are the opposition, you can never be just too far left. I think there needs to be a middle ground in this debate, right, for this particular thing to actually operate. I think there's a few mischaracterization that hasn't essentially been integrated within their particular case. Few important characterization in the setup. I think the first is to actually acknowledge that Leni did win in 2026 for the VP race, but lost in 2022 for the presidential one, which means that her policies of having good governance, transparency, democratic values, equitable development, and pandemic recovery means that she has a purpose, and that it is for the benevolence of the Philippines. But number two, it also looks like an NGO that is there, which necessarily means that it's anti-poverty, and you're trying to cater towards that particular thing as well. The third thing I think is worth noting is how she is advocating for the midterms of 2025 and the presidential in 2028. What this proves here is that she has the burn and the genuine that affirmative so necessarily wants. We think the counterfactual negative is very much simple. We prefer her on the balance sheet instead of anyone else, and instead of not having any greater person in that particular sheet. 2 points of framing here then. The first is that policies and values are principally aligned with the Filipino progressive movement when there is Leni. But number two, Leni is the best shot to combat the long nepotism or the political dynasty in the history of the status quo and also in the Philippines. Before that, let's also just look into the structured responses, right? I like to note the first part, that it is inexclusive for the things that affirmative is saying. They want some sort of political change by having this whole interim period, galvanizing voters, all of these things. Few problems with that. The first, we question what Leni will be doing before then, right? Because if it is so that it is just for the NGO, we don't see the extent or the impact of any of those things except in the last 30 seconds of the first affirmative speech. But number two, how is her relevance after that particular point, right? When she has focused everything for the NGO, we don't see any part at the point which they even mechanize the metric that they put on themselves. This means that principally, they believe that there is some sort of power that Leni has politically, and essentially, if the context was so conservative, was so religiously dogma, we think that it's harder for them to prove how an NGO can mobilize in this particular context. The second thing I want to question here is, what does affirmative really want? Because they act as if the context is so severe and say that the political dynasty is so bad. But what affirmative wants is for Leni to stay silent, which has two impact panels. Number one, you have no change politically. So if you think Bongbong Marcos is so messed up now, it's going to get worse at the point in which there is no change necessarily. But number two, there's no mobilization as a movement or as an NGO because you don't have any of the meaningful policies that they so wanted to defend. The third last thing I want to note here is that this is an active debate. What affirmative wants here is for the progressive movement to just give up and fight for conservative values. This is necessarily not aligned. Where the debate should necessarily stand is when the NGO is somewhat strong, which means that it should be strong as well as a political strategy. Two arguments I'll bring in for today. The first is that Leni is the best shot for the Filipino progressive movement to get any progressive policies. And I'll give you the second argument on necessarily how the progressives will fractionalize in the opposition if you believe in affirmative's case. The first argument, why is Leni's capacity to create policies change significantly bigger when she is our particular candidate? Number one, the power upon election that you have. You can correct, you can reverse harms by the Marcos dynasty necessarily. Which means, at the point in which they do concede that the political dynasty of Bongbong Marcos was so long, which looks like the suppression of ability to express as a university student or in public where you're constantly prosecuted, or number two, to understand that there's no development in certain areas in the Philippines to continuously vote for Bongbong Marcos's populist policies, when you get elected as Leni, you necessarily can change this. But number two, what Leni wants is amplified with her policies that is already aligned in my setup just now, which means the focus on anti-poverty efforts, able to create equitable distribution of wealth, the development of certain areas, or just an increased betterment of the healthcare system. These are things that are intangible at the point in which you do not have Leni as your leader of opposition, or at least as your president. The third thing I want to note here is that Leni is actually able to create a bigger political system, which means because her main goal is for transparency, meaning to say that you are able to prevent political dynasty, to prevent bribery and anti-corruption laws necessarily at the point in which she is the face and she is the power. Conclusion here is that affirmative wants Leni to stay silent. They're denying the progressives like ability to access any benefits that they necessarily have yet to prove to us. Why can we still win this particular election, right? Because they so want to ask us to defend this. Number one, she commands the youth progressives. This looks like centrist, realist, good governance that is within her. We see the trend of the youth actually becoming a lot more progressive within Southeast Asia. We see this in Malaysia, for example, where we essentially voted for Anwar Ibrahim as a youth simply because we understand the impact that it has. But the second thing I want to note here is the rise of progressivism in Philippines, which is the only way that Bongbong Marcos is essentially able to capitalize or try to say that this is the best thing for Philippines. At the point in which there is this rise, this is the right move and strategy for you to actually make. The third thing here is that her NGO has combated the problems because of COVID. We think this is very important to note, right? Because at the point in which you are able to become the face within such a tremendous and atrocious state of time, this is the voter bloc who essentially could have voted for Bongbong Marcos, but because she was there within that particular crisis, this is an impact that they don't have. Comparatively, she did this right, even after her loss. At the point in which we understand this, we think there's far more better things at the point in which she is there. The way in here is a few things. Number one, assuming that affirmative just wants her to do charity, we prove that the magnitude of change that she has is bigger through election. But number two, if affirmative wants a change in election, we still have this on our side. Third thing, she has won the vice president race already. At worst, she can win the midterm. Affirmative defense, essentially vacating a seat that she has already won. Fourth thing, you're no longer competing against Bongbong Marcos, but instead Sarah or Amy, which is a shorter career, easier to debate against them. This is the point in which there is efficacy on our side. Second argument then, progressives will fractionalize the opposition. We think it's important to note the entrenchment of the political dynasty within Philippines. Why is the fractionalizing good for the Bongbong Marcos, but very bad for the progressives? Number one, the gerrymandering that happens in Philippines. It's difficult for you to mobilize because of how the districts are drawn. So this is actually a benefit for Bongbong Marcos, despite which you do not have Leni anyway. But number two, there's already a low voter turnout, which means Bongbong Marcos continuously capitalize this, and it's hard for you to mobilize as a progressive movement. So the smaller sample size of voting, which means to acquire the majority or the tipping point, is far more easier for Bongbong Marcos to do so. Comparatively, Bongbong Marcos stays in power, or Sarah Duterte reigns easier. Why will it fractionalize the particular progressive or the opposition? Number one, you lose the biggest opposition towards Bongbong Marcos. This signals to the progressives that we are losing politically in our fight. There's no capacity for you to galvanize because of the different ideologies, no collectivism to split the voters in their side. Number two, Leni creates more supporters because she's a pillar who necessarily believes in you. So you lose fence-sitters. You lose people who are lethargic of the political dynasty that is necessarily already there in the Philippines. Conclusion here, that even if we don't win election, having Leni and her running for election means that there's sustenance to the opposition and the progressive movements. At the very least, we do not have a fractionalized opposition on the outside. It has to be honest.
Thank you. One and two over and 30 again.
My problem with side negative is that they claim their benefits are not contingent on Leni winning. That's the issue. All of the analysis you hear from their side about how you can create equitable distribution, a bigger political system, prevent corruption, improve low voter turnout, and reduce gerrymandering can only happen if Leni is in a position of power, and not any position of power. They cannot say she'll win the midterm seats, because what is Leni going to do in 2025 when there are 340 seats in parliament and all of them are in support of the current dynasty? Leni is going to stand up and say we need to fight for the poor, and suddenly all the people who have been previously supporting Duterte will say, you know what, she's absolutely right, let's change. I don't know why this is the changing metric. If those are the benefits they want to defend, defend it. But cannot say that the outcome, all we need to reach is to create a system where there's some level of opposition. That's not enough. If you want the benefit of some level of opposition, then defend those outcomes, which is what Kuhan told you anyway. The goal of the progressives in this context is not to do anything major in 2025 and 2028. They already tried that. It didn't work. They even won. Leni was 2016 president. All the wealth of examples that Kuhan told you in what she failed to do. Simple housing policies to help individuals purchase more affordable houses could not be reached. But then they say we will prevent gerrymandering, we will allow so much of voters, we will create a bigger political system, and we will create equitable distribution. How? I'm not sure. This is the major issue on their side. And until we hear substantive material as to how this can be achieved, I don't think it can happen. The reasons they tell you is because Leni commands the centrists. Leni commands the individuals who are progressive. Leni commands the individuals who believe that her NGO are doing a very good job. If that is true, why the hell did she lose as an independent in 2022? These are all the characteristics that she still has. I'm uncertain as to why these are the big changes, or this is the initial analysis that allowed her to reach this position in power. But best case, she reaches that position in power. VP is a position that is only ceremonial. What is she going to do in this position to create the impacts that you want to create? So best case, she gets the power through whatever means that they say can get. She does command all these individuals, but ultimately the context is the same. They are a minority. I don't know why as a minority, just because you command the entire minority, you don't fractionalize them and you keep them consolidated, they can achieve all these big changes that they claim. So even if that is true, I don't think they can claim on these benefits. Moving on, done with responses. Last response is this idea of NGOs. They claim that because the NGO is strong, we need to pivot this strength of the NGO into politics. I'm uncertain as to why there's no mechanistic link as to why if you're charitable, you're an activist, you can achieve political change. These two things are fundamentally different. They have fundamental different characteristics, and you need to do different things in order to attain power, concessions, and compromises. Not the same with NGO, where if someone is interested in your cause, they give you a donation, and if you're a good person, you use the donation to help others. That's it. That's all that Leni needs to do, and she does that really well. But we've already seen her in a position of political power, and she couldn't do anything. Why will this change? I'm not sure. Why will someone vote for a political party because the candidate has a great NGO? If some of you are voters here, if that is how you vote, I think you need to change how you decide to vote, because that's not how you vote a person to power. Argumentation. Why this will devalue Angat Buhay as a whole, and why this is of particular importance to the progressive community. Like what Kuhan told you, the progressive demographic in the Philippines are extremely understanding, or at least realistic, about what are the goals they can attain by the time the election comes around. The most important goal here is to protect the demographic that they claim they want to protect. How do they do this if they only claim that we are fighting for you? We are going to the vice president and we are saying no gerrymandering, but nobody is seeing any change. Disasters are happening, nobody can do anything from the side of the state. But who is doing something? It's exactly this NGO. Who's in charge of this NGO? Leni Robredo. If the moment in which Leni Robredo leaves or has to divide her time between her political goals and the NGO's goals, you are going to lose these impacts. If you lose the impact of directly engaging with the community that you are helping or that you claim to defend, you are likely going to lose them in the long run. So your fractionalization of the minority will even become worse, because on top of not getting anything from the state, you are also not getting anything from the community that says we want to help you a lot. I don't know why this is something that the progressives would appreciate. There are no alternatives for the people that are directly being impacted by all persecutions of state, because there's no NGO that can challenge Angat Buhay's impacts currently in status quo. But is there someone who is against the political dynasty in the Philippines and wants to create a change, who has been a career politician? I can think of 50. The point is, there are multiple alternatives in their world. They act as if Leni Robredo herself doesn't stand in the face of opposition, every single person in the progressive movement will decide not to become a voter anymore. They'll fractionalize, they will go and become extreme. Why is this true? Any individual that is charismatic, a career politician, willing to do the things that Leni could not do, is indeed a better choice anyway. And worst case, if they lose, like what Kuhan told you, that's not what we're defending. We're defending expanding the power, maybe increasing the number of seats in 2025 in the midterm elections, and hopefully in 2033, in 2035, we can get into power. But if that doesn't happen, at the very least, we've built a solid solid foundation that cannot be persecuted by the state, or we get better mechanisms to challenge the problems that they're talking about, gerrymandering or devaluing certain demographics, as opposed to them where all the benefits can only be contingent if you occupy a significant position of power and everyone around you supports you too. Best case, even if you are the president, I'm not sure why everyone else below you is going to listen to what you have to say. The only way they can achieve those benefits is to do what Duterte does. Executive power, unilateral decision. You tell me, if you are a progressive, why is that something you'd be okay with, even if the impact is something you say is great? Ultimately, even if you want to win on principle that we need to do better, it's not going to come at the cost of you having unilateral decision or absolute power to create this impact. If that's what they're going to defend, they need to show us why that's in the interest of progressive. Second argument about why this is likely going to help as a buffer to state persecution. Again, as what Kuhan told you, the demographic that are protected by this NGO are the most vulnerable people and are the biggest interest for these individuals. How can this then expand the growth of progressive and eventually lead to more power? We think that it will allow her to grow her base because this is the key starting point for anyone that has been persecuted by the state. Ethnic minority or not, poor person or not, someone who doesn't live in the city, you are all beneficiaries of this NGO. It is very likely that as Leni Robredo, the leader of this NGO, you are likely going to see a big engagement within these individual bases. The fact that the state needs to be challenged, the fact that conservative values cannot be more important than living a life of dignity. This is the only way in which you can change the people and hope they can support you. Ultimately, even in this instance, Leni Robredo can still be the spokesperson for the opposition party. The info slide says that she doesn't mind supporting whoever is going to be the opposition candidate to challenge against this political dynasty. With the fact that she has a successful NGO and a track record that nobody can challenge in terms of activism, it is more likely that her seal of approval will result in greater changes or will result in greater support, as opposed to her standing up and fighting, and we all can compare to the political decisions that she has made and say, why does she deserve to be in power? Why does she deserve our support? What has she done that can validate our claims and cure our problems? Nothing. Someone else can do, and with the support of Leni Robredo, it is more likely that they will be successful. Ultimately, our substantive material proves why we are more likely to get greater change in the long run, why Leni Robredo is better for the NGOs, and why for the progressive movement, this is the best thing they can do in the interim. For those reasons, proud to affirm.
Thank you. Second affirmative, second negative, whenever you're ready, here.
Affirmative argues that in a context where all voters vote for Bongbong Marcos anyway, then they just have to lower their standards and change what they particularly believe in. That's precisely the problem, because the progressive movement and the progressives in Philippines know better than just to destroy and reduce the principles that believe in. Because the more we lower our standards, the less the progressive movements fight. It's because the person that we advocated for is no longer the person that believes in our ideologies. They can never really prove why the progressives are in line with this conservative person that they want to fight for. We think that's precisely the problem. It's because they don't necessarily believe the same things. The reason why the second affirmative team is unstrategic, and when they say that they want to get things slowly in 2025, is because of two things. Number one, we can co-opt all of that. Given that Leni is capable, and given that Leni has political careers already, we can have that too. We can win potentially in 2025. But the question that we like to ask secondly to the affirmative team is, why try in 10 years? Because by that time, Bongbong Marcos would have already created a political dynasty that would have been unparalleled and infinitely harder for any progressive to advocate for. Couple of things I'll do. Firstly, I'll prove that if this is really aligned with the progressive, because that is the precise actor that we have to advocate for. Secondly, do we have to give up charity? Thirdly, can she get elected? Firstly, is this politically aligned? We argue that Leni is liberal, and they conceded to this in their first speech. Their best response is, it doesn't matter, because the context is everyone is conservative anyway. Let's pick out why this is unstrategic. Because we are the progressive movement and progressives in Philippines. Even in conservative spaces, we can never change our ideals to a politician that is never representative. Note that they're really arguing for a centrist person. You have to give up some level of policies. This is harmful for two pragmatic reasons. Number one, even if the politician that they want to fight for wins, you will never have any progressive policies anyway. So let's assume the best case of the affirmative team. You get that seat. But the progressives would have never gotten anyway. All of the harms manifest as well. But secondly, if you have a centrist or a conservative to capitulate to the people on the ground, then it's far easier for these people to hijack for the people who are in the dynasty to hijack this politician. Literally, because Bongbong Marcos already controls the population, right? Which means that they're going to be more susceptible to things like making trade-offs whenever fighting for politicians. The trade-offs that these people are going to make are always going to be the progressives first. That's why it's pragmatically harmful. But the second reason why this is unstrategic is because of a far bigger problem. Because it's unprincipled. If we have a centrist in our ballot box, nobody will ever fight for the progressives in the future. This is about political ideology. This is about rhetoric and hope that keeps burning activists on the ground. Sure, maybe she didn't do much in the VP position, but that allowed the activists to keep on doing NGO work on the ground. That prevented activist lethargy and activist burnout, because you have a chance in there, you have a seat. This allowed people to at least talk to that political representative that was at the very least representative of your view. The question that we want to ask them is, who fights for you? If Leni is not there, then who will ever be tabling your policies to Duterte or Bongbong Marcos? And this already happens in the Philippines. Right after she lost, a lot of Filipino youth leaders left the country because of brain drain and because of literal lost hope of the political climate. That will exacerbate the point in which when there's literally nobody there on the ballot box. This is instrumental because progressive people in the Philippines are the ones who have the most political capital. These are the people, the doctors, the professionals who they're going to be far more, that are incredibly important for the political race. What this proves is they have been unstrategic. We argue that even if we lose, at the very least this is aligned, at the very least we have representation. We win the principal clash. Secondly, do we have to give up on charity? These are two things. Number one, you're going to lose a lot of time, and number two, you will get more attacks if you don't support your charity. We argue that flip, which is they're more likely to get more charity on our side of the house. Because number one, that has literally been the way that Leni got political mileage. Right after she lost the election, the only way she knew that she was going to make a political comeback is by having that NGO. But secondly, we get a lot more pressure if we don't actively go for these charities. Because it's our campaign promise in the long run in order to get any structural change. This is literally the vehicle to get grassroots support. Given the climate that everyone already believes in Bongbong Marcos anyway, we think the comparative is using these poor people, the people who are in the grassroots movements, to attach the political message to that, so that at the very least they flip. And on a scale, we have more potential of voting, of reducing the Bongbong Marcos voters and electing Leni supporters. But second response to this is, the argument that they give on the last breathing minutes of the first speech and the second speech is that they can see that Leni is quite strong and has a lot of power in the NGOs. This is literally a no-brainer as to why they will use that that as a political capital and political tool in order to get such structural change. This already happens in a large chunk of Southeast Asia, where in Malaysia there's this Bandera Putih movement, where people realize that the government is doing poorly and NGOs are attaching political rhetorics to them in order to vote out politicians in the long run. So even if we don't have that, we think it's far better to attach that political messaging on the at worst. But thirdly, even if she's super busy, right, like with this NGO, with the political race, I have no reason why she's not going to just pass it on to someone else. Specifically because NGO work is completely manageable. Like literally, they haven't really proven to us why it is a trade-off. Third issue then, can she get elected? The first affirmative says that she has failed before and nobody trusts her at all. We argue this is untrue for a couple of reasons. The first is that they have the youth votes, but number two, we have political. She has a political career that is long-standing. But we argued as a best case, even like let's just intuition pump real quick. Did we ever judge politicians based on their track records, especially in dictatorial regimes? They argue that they have bad housing plans, but the reason why she lost in the presidential race is because Duterte was the one that was dictating political choices, and there he was the one who was enforcing anything and clamping down on political dissidents, creating a war on drugs. All these things, is in addition to the Bongbong Marcos political mileage from the Marcos generation, allowed her to, this allowed her from ever winning the next election. But the comparative is far simpler. If we keep fighting, at the very least, we allow people to feel as if they are represented. This is already a net benefit, because if we get that level of representation and if people feel as if they are represented, this means that they go out to vote. This means that they at least interact with the politicians. They question the politicians in the grassroots. We think that's inherently a net benefit because we promise them some level of unity. Argument then, having Leni in political race is better than her absence. This frame here is, even if she loses, there is nobody that is ready to replace her, and this engages with the argument on F. They argue the next person is going to be good. We think even if they are good, they are low capital, relatively to Leni, who has been in office before and has gotten a lot of political dividends from just rising through the ranks, right? Because it's impossible for you to believe that she just got there by virtue of being there. We think that's quite a niche spec knowledge, but even if it's true, then we think that the second reason is far more important, which is that even if you have this conservative person that's frontlining in the political race, they lack grassroots support. Not enough people know you, not enough people know your messaging. At the very least, we have the comparative of having an NGO that has transcended communities. The third reason is, and this is very important, right? You are going to make it very, very hard to overcome the next politicians that will be on the ballot box in 2025 and 2028. It's Sara Duterte, who literally is the sister of Duterte. It's Emi Marcos, who is literally the person that got who is the son of the Marcos dynasty. Perhaps the affirmative team can name and think of a lot of politicians, but we think that they haven't really proven why Leni is worse. We take this bit. Thanks.
Thank you, second negative. Those numbers whenever you're ready, keep it.
As a leftist myself, I think the most annoying thing about leftism is the fact that we all care about passion and we want to do the right thing, but there is absolutely no roadmap of getting those meaningful changes in the status quo. And I think that is the embodiment of the negative case in this debate, because they talk about things like the principal importance of why Leni should run and why we should stand up for the minorities and the vulnerable groups, why we should do the right thing. But when we look closely at their case, Judge, I think you will realize that there is a significant lack of mechanism in attaining a lot of those benefits, given a lot of the claims and metrics that they set out in the debate. Metrics like the fact that BBM or the conservative base has already a chokehold in the status quo, has already done things like gerrymandering, has already established a political dynasty, means a lot of the flimsy mechanisms on their side become even flimsier. I will bury them in my speech. Two call-outs at the top of my speech. Firstly, why the case is self-defeatist at worst, but even at best, it's value neutral. Let's look at why firstly it is self-defeatist, and this looks at specifically the argument that one end pushed to us on the fracturing of progressives. They told us things like gerrymandering and the fact that there's a low voter turnout and that we need to stand up against this. The first response, the response I already had in the opening line, that if these are the characteristics of Filipino politics at this instance, wouldn't it then be harder to win? And that is why a shift in trajectory is important. But the second response that I have, if the only thing we need to do is stand up for the right thing, is to voice up for the vulnerable groups and the minorities, why can't the other candidates do that as well under our side? The problem of side affirmative is that they haven't proved What is the unique ability of Leni Robredo? What is the unique position that she has or that she has cemented within Filipino politics that has allowed her to stand up for the right thing much better? I think that is the principal failure of the side of affirmative. But the second call out that I have is the value neutral part of the aspect of the entire case, right? They talk about things like the power that you get from running in an election and why winning in an election is so important. But they never talk about, again, what is the mechanisms of reaching that power. But secondly, they talk about activating the impacts of the NGO without telling us why her ability or her position within the administration allows us to activate the impact better of the NGO versus what we said in our side in things like why her political life and an activist life is difficult to intertwine given the difference in commitments, etc. I will flesh out all these issues in my speech. Moving on then to two clashes that I want to talk about. Number one, on what's best for the Progressive Party, and number two, on what's best for Angat Buhay and our ability to help minorities. I just want to preface this clash that I think the reminder that First Anne gave in their speech is quite important, that this is an actor debate. But I would forward this reminder to the rest of the negative bench, because if this is an active debate as the Filipino Progressive Party, you can't just give reasons like she's still passionate, she still wants to do it, she still has the drive, because we are debating this motion from the perspective of the Filipino Progressive Party, the perspective of a Filipino Progressive Party that has seen Leni show instances of being burnt out, that has shown Leni showing a dissatisfaction towards the entire politics, showing Leni giving up and only stepping up when she realizes that nobody else wants to do it. I think it is pretty difficult for you to have epistemic access to the fact that she wants a drive when all her actions thus far has proved against that drive. But let's look at specifically why this is a problem within the clash. The first part to this clash looks at status quo and current systems and current environments. What we told you in the side of affirmative is on the perception of people, and we broke it down into two parts. Number one, on the perspective of non-progressives. Why many people see Leni as a divisive figure within Filipino politics, which makes it much harder for you to get the votes that you want to talk about, to get the votes of the poor minorities and all these vulnerable groups that you want to talk about, especially when these are the individuals that the Marcos administration has a chokehold over, which means it doesn't mean that what they say is conveniently true about how you can use this NGO as a vessel to push for politics, because you can give these people all the help. You can tell them that we're going to help you build your house, we're going to give you welfare, but that still won't allow them to to disconnect from all the conservative ideals that they're going to have. It's not going to allow them to disbelieve in the idea that Marcos and a conservative government is what's best for them, especially when the context that we have set out in this debate is how conservatism is so entrenched within Filipino politics. But then we also talked about why this is extremely difficult for progressives, especially when a lot of the trajectory that they want to quote in their speech comes from the voice of the majorities of her bases within the metro area instead of the minorities, within more urban voters instead of the minorities, which means that a lot of the trajectory that you're bound to get even in future elections is going to be from this group. But also, the second idea to this is that a lot of times in your idea and your model of what Leni Robredo should do, you're hinging the success of the entire party on Leni. A lot of the characterizations that they provide for Leni, things like she is a leader, she is a trailblazer, she is a known face, means that a lot of times the success of the Progressive Party then is hinged on her being able to win the politics within her constituencies, which means that at the point at which they don't prove this, which I just want to remind they haven't, they are hinging the success on something that is very improbable, breaking the certainty in their side of the debate. But let's talk about what they specifically had to say. They say she still has influence, and they quote the fact that she has won the VP vote. I think Ram responded to this perfectly by talking about why the VP position within Filipino politics is exclusively ceremonial. But secondly, despite her holding this VP position, the fact that she still lost the candidacy, doesn't that just point to the fact that people don't trust her even when she has established a position within the administration? It just shows to her failure of doing important things that are able to get her the votes that are necessary. But the second thing then that they said is that they are able to co-opt all the benefits in the interim as well. But they can't do this because of what we talked about in terms of negative perception, but also the shared obligations that they have. But the second part to this clash talks about the future. And here's where we fleshed out the comparison
comparative. We talk about why any other particular candidate will be better for 3 reasons. Number 1, that it's a new face, so it's a lot fresher. Secondly, the fact that it's a centrist. Thirdly, the fact that we're able to get more career politicians instead of activists. So these point to the ideas of Larry Colmenares, Leila de Lima, Bam Aquino, and etc. The reason why we don't have to push a specific candidate is because the idea that Leni Robredo has been the face of the Progressive Party for very long means that we can just make educated guesses about what our comparatives look like. And that is why it is much better, because you're unlikely going to get the polarization that Leni Robredo will cause in her world. You're unlikely going to be politically attacked and used as political capital by the opposition party. But the negative says the outcomes will become a lot worse, the chokehold will become a lot worse, but this is untrue for all the reasons I told you in the opening line, and this also responds to the idea of political burnout, because number 1, this can't just be the response, because this has happened for decades. If this has happened for decades, I would argue that the political burnout has already existed in your world. But the second reason as to why this is true is that you're likely going to burn out more people at the point at which you don't give them something new to look for. But the second clashes on what's best for Angat Buhay and our ability to help our minorities. We told you very clearly on side of affirmative why Leni should focus on this NGO that she started after she lost, by the way. So don't be confused by the timeline that side negative is trying to push you, which means that number 1, she's much able to be committed given that she has disconnected from a political career, therefore amplifying the benefits that this is supposed to have. They said they can just pass this NGO to someone else. No, especially not when you have started it, that you have trailblazed in this, that you have amplified and you have acted as a catalyst for this particular NGO to achieve all its outcomes. They said that we also told you why people are able to screw her over for this very reason. Accuse her of cronyism, accuse her of siphoning money into this particular NGO, which doesn't just hurt her political identity, but hurts the political identity of the entire Filipino leftist movement. And that is why their case fails. Not just because they do what's worse for the candidate that we're talking about, but because they don't do any benefit for the push for progressivism within an important country. So proud.
Judges, if any of you are ready to
Before I start my speech, I just want to give 2 shout-outs. First shout-out is to my mom. I'm really sorry for not calling you on your birthday. I guess I have an important duty. I swear I'm not a bad son. Secondly, I just want to shout out to Malaysian contingent. Like what Rashmin always said, regardless who wins this round, there will be one Malaysian in the finals. So you're all family. Yeah. Let's do that. Begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. In order for politicians to build their credibility to even become a vice president, there requires a decade amount of experience and effort and engagement within the political scene. The problem with our affirmative side is they suggest to us that it's actually much better to have her inside the NGO, which by the way, she only built it within 1 way and already found success, rather than fighting for the fight of the progressive community and progressive parties that already exist within the Philippines, who have been fighting against a political dynasty that exists. If affirmative wants to create NGO, I'm not entirely sure why exactly their NGO is going to be much different, because there's already a lot of NGO that already exists in Philippines. And just like what Shaki explained to you, that you can also have another person replacing her in order to actually lead the NGO, because in the end of the day, it's just about how exactly you're going to add more, help people to relieve from their poverty. I don't think it requires a lot of effort to begin with, but in order for you to lead a political party, to go against a political dynasty, you require a lot of credibility. You require a lot of effort. You require a lot of strength and a lot of trust from people, and that's the only thing that Leni has, which is why we prefer her to stay within the power. I want to note, if they suggest to us that, well, we're going to substitute her with other politicians, that already wins us debate. Because one, they assume to us that, well, it's going to be very conservative. That means it's very hard for us to put Leni to begin with. But we're going to get another person to get into it. This person who has no credibility as Leni, has no reputation as Leni, is more likely to win, not entirely sure why. But even if you don't buy the response,
Our suggestion is that instead of just having that one another person in the party or running for election, let's have Leni and that person as well, which means that you are more likely to get 2 seats, which means you are more likely to increase your power within the political party, which is why you are able to win it. Let's be clear, what exactly the progressive people want? Because I want to know, maybe their argument is correct. You are able to help a lot of poverty people, poor people. You're able to relieve a lot of disaster. But the problem is that that's not what exactly the Progressive Party wants. The Progressive Party wants is an accountability mechanism that exists within Philippines against the political dynasty that has existed for a very long time. Somebody who is strong enough to actually go against them. Somebody who are more likely to win election. Somebody who can actually ensure that we're able to protect the survivability of the Progressive Party, which is why we already proved to you why exactly it's more likely for us to achieve that. Their argument about why exactly the charity is good cannot win this debate. 2 issues that I want to argue in this speech. Firstly, why exactly the end goal is the one that we want to achieve as a progressive thing? There are 2 broad claims that we heard from that side of the house. One is that we're able to actually use other candidates. I want to directly deal with this. First, I want to note to you that they never actually proved to you why exactly other candidate is better. Note that they proved to us they are more likely to win, but not better at handling politics game. Here's why we explain to you why exactly she is better. One is because of her experience within the power. That means that she's more likely to actually be able to find out how exactly the political games looks like, how exactly horse trading looks like, where exactly we should actually target in order for us to win, what kind of policy that we should prioritize more, especially to reverse all the Bongbong Marcos policy. But 2, I just want to note, their main assertion here is that, well, Leni doesn't want to actually be politicians anymore. One, it does not make sense. The motion literally says that she wants to actually run for election again in the future. You have to go against CAP if you want to do that. But 2 is literally that she wants to create a lot of changes. It was evident because the fact that she decided to do all of those NGO to begin with means that she believed that she can still have the capacity to create changes, and we're saying that she should channel all of those changes within the political party. Here's the deadlock breaker here, right? Maybe it is correct that they suggest to us that the other new person is actually very good. But the problem is that in both situations, the center, the left, and also the right are unlikely to believe and trust this new person, which means that they are unlikely to actually vote them in, which is why they are unlikely to win. At the very least, you get already the support of the progressive, which means that you are able to keep your seat, which is why we are more likely to win on that. The second impact that they suggest to us is that she's able to fully committed to it. I want to know, firstly, is that she's still able to capitalize on her NGO, and this is what we argue to you. Because the fact is, whenever you are trying to actually have an NGO, that means that you are trying to capitalize it to show that you are able to actually help the life of the people, and this is why you should vote me in. This is a good way for them to actually get elected. But secondly, I want to you because of the fact that you are able to get more power at the point where you want to do all of this NGO thing. So for example, if you want to help the poor people, the best way to do it is to actually have policy that says we need to build a lot more school within the poor area. Problem with them is that they're just literally trying to substitute the power of the government. And here's the problem, because the government will no longer help the poor area because they will just say the NGO will do it, which is why there's no accountability. Let's weigh up the argument, the impact. First, maybe on that side of the house they get what they want, right? Their benefits of poverty. We explain to you why exactly we're able to amplify all of those benefits. We explain to you we're able to change it from just a charity to become a policy where it is mandated to build more schools, especially because a lot of islands within the Philippines requires a lot more things. But secondly, I want to know, this is the best time, because the fact is the urgency is already huge here. The fact is Bongbong Marcos got into power, already entrenched the power of conservative and political dynasty. This is the time where we need to ensure that there is an accountability and check and balance that exists within Philippines. Because the second you don't fight against that, you literally allow the conservatives to continue rampant within Philippines, which means that they are more likely to win in the future, and you don't have any ability to win in the future, which is far worse on that side of the house, because they no longer have accountability of somebody going against that. But maybe we don't get into power, and why exactly is still better? Because the fact is we're still able to maintain the political party, because the fact that we already explained to you, at the point where you live, you no longer have this somebody who actually can unite everyone and ensure that the Progressive Party will be sustainable for the next 10 to 15 years. This is important because on that side of the house, they are literally going to fractionalize it, which is far worse. That means the ability to combat against conservatism is far better on our side of the house. That alone wins the debate. Second issue that they always want to is trying to engage on, which is that are we likely to win? I want to point out is that if they use other people, I just want to point out that they're literally also not going to get other people because of their characterization of conservativeness. I don't know why new person equals to like more likely to win. At the very least, we prove to you reputation and credibility are able to actually ensure that people feel secure that they're able to stay in power. They say the conservatism within the Philippines. One, we explain to you that conservatism may be rampant in the Philippines, but there's a rise of progressiveness because of the fact Bongbong Marcos got into power. We're able to capitalize on this at the point where you have somebody who already won in the past and says that, let's go guys, we have the capacity to win. In order for us to change, we are able to do this. But the second thing they say is that the interest of like disassociating. One, I want to point out, there's just assert that to us that the Progressive Party wants to disassociate from the past failure. I'm not entirely sure why exactly the past failure. In order for you to be able to even compete or contest for like president, means that you have a huge capacity, means you have a huge influence for you to be able to put that, which is why they are more likely to get it. But two, notice that how exactly they never mentioned how much that Leni lost. Leni lost 47 to 53%, which means that she's very close in terms of like getting into power, but never English to that. Let's weigh up the ability to get winning that. One, I want to note to you this is the best time because as I explained to you, the rise of progressiveness is very increasing right now. And the second you lose the ability to capitalize on this, that means you will never have second chance. But secondly, it's the fact that people prefer the one that they know. Even if like the conservative people or people who are in rural area, at the very least they see like somebody who has been a vice president before, they are more likely to believe these persons are credible and trustworthy and have the capacity to handle the country. But thirdly, you are able to get more power through your influence, which is why you are more likely to win. But finally, as I already explained to you, the threshold of this argument is very simple. We just have to prove to you that we are more likely to win. That means that you have, and as I explained here in my first issue, is that the impact of like winning is already huge. That means that we already proved to you that as long as we are more likely to win, we're able to get all of our impact within the first issue, which is why we have to win this debate for all those reasons. Mara, final thought.
Thank you, Fran. Next slide when you're ready.
The affirmative team suggests that the context is very bad and conservatives are super strong and have a chokehold. Our worst case scenario is that Bongbong Marcos wins again and then Leni loses, which would have already happened in status quo anyway, given their context that conservatives would have all win anyway. The bigger picture here is we don't win, which the affirmative teams that we would have lost anyway, which means that their case is inherently value neutral. At the very least, we have principles on our side, and if you credit their context, then this principle is the deadlock breaker in the entire debate. The second observation is they have a person that we don't know, and probably is one of these politicians that would likely run instead of Leni, which just proves our point of fractionalization because they can't really tell us who exactly they want to galvanize the support. The educated guess that they say is that they will be unprogressive and conservative to pander to people. But this means that number one, this is the same person that won't propose the progressive policies, but number two is susceptible to conservative and centrist ideologies, which means that the absolute best case is someone who wins, but it's a person that was never representative of you on an ideological standpoint, but also never representative of you when they are forced to propose and table policies. Perhaps they have a conservative person that is the puppet of the progressive, but that person would have never fought for progressive ideologies anyway. So perhaps in absolute worst case, their name isn't Bongbong, but they will just be as evil, and the worst part is that these people are the ones that voted for these individuals. Two bigger picture claims then. Firstly, can we win the election, and secondly on the principle. Just note that we will use the same exact galvanizing apparatuses. So note that when we say we can co-opt all of their mechs, it's literally just by saying that we can use all of the same social media, we can use all the same campaigning, which is probably in the same party. We argue in first that we have the power of the youth and we have grassroots support. These are things that they didn't really challenge because they concede that the NGO is particularly strong. But the contention that they have is that she has failed in the past. If this is true, they haven't really told us why another person would have not failed in the Duterte administration, because they haven't really proven their comparative, right? Because if they say the absolute worst case is that Bongbong Marcos wins again, well, their context says that Bongbong Marcos would have won anyway, which means that at the very least we win on a scale. We think that the comparative is far better because number one, she is relatively more credible than any other politician that they can name or they cannot name, and secondly, that she has more mileage just because of her grassroots support that is unparalleled given that they concede that the NGO is particularly strong, which means three things. Number one, if we lost, we would have lost anyway. Number two, if we lost, we tried and we try again in the next election, which is also what they want, which means we play the long game anyway. But thirdly, if we run, at the very least we get a seat in the office, in our constituency, that is already a net benefit. We vacate that seat on that side of the house. The principle then, we argued how this is literally just morally aligned with the voter bloc that Leni fights for. These are progressive policies like having equitable change, good distribution of wealth, and inherently good governance. They say that progressives just give up on that because leftists are just ideologically driven, and that's inherently wrong. But we contested that that's literally not what the progressives fight for. The progressives, in every step of the way, even in a literal political dynasty like Imelda Marcos's dynasty, we literally still advocated for grassroots support. We never gave up because that is the point in which we have because if we give up there and we reduce our standards, that's the point in which we lose in general. The status quo is much more dire because if we do not have any hope in this next election, is that more people leave the country, more people are lethargic, and activists burn out. The benefit on our side of the house, even if we lose, is that we have some level of confidence. People on the ground can call their politician and say that please tell this to the vice president and tell the vice president to tell it to the president. We think this instills trust, and this is trust that will be the bedrock of all other elections in the future. For all those reasons, we take this speech.
Thank you, next reply. After reply, whenever you're ready.
It's funny that side negative says the most valuable consideration in this debate is principle, ideological purity. If you compromise on those principles and you get someone with watered down policy, that is the end of the progressive movement. Is that true? In every government in the history of the developing world, ideological purity is not a major concern when there's a shift in democracy. It's about winning. It's about getting seats. It's about building your voter bloc and getting change. It's not about doing what they say. They say the here, but today until now, did they tell you how Leni Robredo is going to pass her educational policy? I don't see that. They tell you even if we lose, nothing will. She already lost once before, at least it will inspire confidence and tell the vice president to tell the president later. How does politics work that way? That's not how it works. Who inspires confidence if you lose twice in a row to the same person for the same exact reasons? The fact that you are not likely to capture these people, or the fact that these people are not getting any benefit from you other than the fact of saying, listen to me, I can help you. I'm trying my best and I'm trying my hardest and I'm a principled person. It doesn't win in politics. Maybe it can win in debates, but I hope it's not this one. Moving on to main issue, which is where can change happen best? I think, again, none of their case engage with the current context of how this problem is really bad. The only thing they tell you is that BBM is in power now, we need to act immediately. It's as if before BBM, it was a very nice man that wanted to do many great things. It was Duterte, for God's sake. Labas has been in charge for a very long time. The fact that BBM is now in charge and we need to act quickly makes no sense to me, because what is the quick change that you are doing? Is it the fact that if you win one seat and you say, it's only been 2 years, now if I say something, you must listen to me? No, the political process is still going to remain the same. The likeliness of where you are a minority is still going to be the same. The fact that even if they claim, best case we have 2 people, we can get 2 seats in the 2025 midterm election. Again, 340 parliamentary seats, you have 2. You tell me what education policy you are going to get and why that is weighed against all the intangible direct benefits that the NGO is doing. Then they say, you can get another person to do it. If you can get another person to do it, or NGO is very easy to launch, why you tell me NGOs cannot have this impact in every other country as well? The fact that Angat Buhay is uniquely successful and is an anomaly in status quo means that Leni Robredo is doing something good here. That is the point. Not that you can replace it with someone else. And if you like that characterization, flip it to our side. Why must Leni Robredo be the only voice of principles? It's as if she's the only person that is left-wing in Philippines. I really don't think that's the case, because there are many people that do not like BBM. Ultimately, if it is true that it's not as valuable, then I don't think they can claim all of these benefits on the side of politics. Then we tell you, what are we defending? They tell you we never defended our comparative to show why our alternative can win. I don't know why this is our burden. Kuhan told you from the very beginning, in context that is extreme as this, our goal is one thing: improve current situation. We want to build a base, we want to get the voters to be engaged, and we hope that one day we can challenge power. In our world, even if we get seats, we're not going to claim the benefit of being representative or being able to enact policy. We are claiming the benefit of, to some extent, being there. And being there will allow us to grow. Growing will allow us to win. That's it. How do we grow? That is from our side. The fact that you are not attaching a person who has failed multiple times in the past in politics and putting her as the front of the opposition is going to mean that you are more likely going to win. We don't know if the alternative that we presented is better than Leni Robredo, but at the very least, she is new. She does not attach to many failures, and the perception surrounding her is not as bad as the one that is surrounding Leni Robredo. And in terms of the NGO, the more people you have that are directly affected by the state is where the progressive movements can then build that ground and create the greatest catalyst for change. For all those reasons, proud to affirm.